What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Bass Fishing Declassified. In this video, I want to share how you can find tournament-winning areas in the fall, or at least areas where you can catch big fish or a big limit of fish. In our last lake breakdown video, I talked about finding quick limit areas where you can catch a lot of small fish quickly, but we're going to do the opposite in this video. We're looking for areas that produce just big fish. I'm going to start by taking a look at Lake 10 Killer here in Oklahoma because it has a nice lake drawn down image on Google Earth. But a lot of times you're not going to find what I'm going to be showing you in this video on Google Earth unless you have these lake images that are drawn down. Most of the time you're going to have to find these areas with side imaging, down imaging, 2D sonar. The thing I'm really looking for, and I'm just going to go straight to it, are basically areas where you have an isolated bigger piece of cover, and I'm going to kind of draw around this cover just to kind of give you guys what this is. It's just a nice boulder or a nice big rock that's maybe the size of the front deck of your boat, and it's out on a flat or some area that's in less than 10 feet of water most of the time. A lot of these bass in the fall want to be setting up shallow or less than 10 feet, and you're going to find that you'll catch better than average quality fish on these isolated targets that are sometimes close to the bank, they're visible, and sometimes they're further off the bank. Obviously, the ones that are further off the bank will be better, and the image that I just marked up right here is when the lake is drawn down quite a bit. So depending on your lake level, this is what the lake looks like at normal pool, but if the lake is drawn down a few feet, maybe it's just barely visible, and if it's drawn down really low for winter pool, you can actually see it right on the bank. But ideally, you would want this rock to be in 5-10 feet of water off the bank. And as I mentioned, it doesn't have to necessarily just be out on a big flat. It could also be in the back of a shallow pocket where you have a few nice big rocks that have nothing else around in the area. Again, if that lake is at full pool, you won't see those rocks. And as the lakes get drawn down in the fall, you're going to have to adjust for the type of areas you're looking for based on that water level. So we may find that there are areas that have that nice rock I'm showing right here, and they're sitting out here in the middle of this pocket out here. And we can't see them on this Google Earth image, but again, you can graph them with down imaging, side imaging, 2D sonar. And if you can find a big isolated rock in the middle of this pocket, your chances of catching a better than average fish are going to go up dramatically in the fall. Most of the time what I'm going to do on these areas is target them with a pretty aggressive bait, whether that's a jerk bait, a big swim bait like a Megabass Mag Draft, a glide bait, or a big jig. And I'm going to be going into these areas. Again, you can look for them with your mapping and stuff like that, but most of the time I'm just going to go through with side imaging and side image through these areas and find those bigger isolated pieces of rock. If it's a really big stump in a stump field, there's all kinds of stuff you can kind of find, but the main thing is finding these isolated objects, and they're not that easy to find, and that's why the better fish I feel like are attracted to them, and a lot of times why if you can run enough of them you can catch a big limit, but they're also kind of underutilized or underfished by other anglers. If we go down one of these banks, we can see that there are some really big rocks and stuff like that are visible to the eye, but there's also those same rocks that are out here in the middle of nowhere. Here's like another big boulder. And one of my recommendations when trying to find these isolated objects is go to a creek where on Google Earth you can actually see some of these bigger rocks. When you see a big rock like this on the bank here, the likelihood that there's another big one somewhere out here is pretty likely, versus if you go into a pocket, for example, on the other side of the lake, maybe back in here, where I guess that's a bad example because I can see some. Let me try to find a pocket that doesn't have a ton of big rocks in it. 10 Killer actually has, a pretty good number of these creeks that have bigger rocks in them, but maybe like a pocket like this where you can see most of the rocks are pea gravel and then there's some sand and stuff, which these can be productive areas at times as well, but most of the time I'm not going to find bigger chunk rock or bigger isolated rock in this area. Instead, I'm going to find that in a creek where I actually see bigger boulders on the shoreline. Now, you can catch fish on these just bigger boulders if the lake is up, but a lot of other guys fish those in the fall, so it's not like you're necessarily going to have those to yourself. So finding that same boulder that's 5 feet deep out here in the middle that's not visible even on the mapping here, a lot of times can produce a lot of really good fish, and it's something that a lot of anglers overlook and don't really think about. when they're trying to fish in the fall, because most of the time they just roll in these creeks and just fish the most obvious pieces of cover. And what I will say is, if you have caught fish in the fall on a certain type of cover, whether that is a bigger laydown, a bigger blowdown, a bigger piece of chunk rock, and you notice you caught a 3 or 4 pounder on it, try to look for those same things under the water. They're invisible to the naked eye, and try to find them with your fish finder. And a lot of times you can produce some really good quality bites. Now, the main challenge with this is that you have to find enough of those. So a lot of times it takes time graphing or doing map study to find those isolated boulders. You could graph through this whole creek and maybe only find 4, 5, 6 of those boulders they're setting up properly. The other thing is that usually it's better if you can get some type of wind or some low light conditions to get those fish really aggressive around these objects. So what you might find is that you can find a couple of boulders down this bank here, and when there's a north wind blowing, you can actually get those fish to bite. That water's moving, maybe a west or east wind is blowing across that boulder. But when there's a south wind, those areas are very calm and you can't get bit. So you may need to find some boulders that are on these northern banks that when that south wind is blowing, it actually blows into here, and you can find some boulders or, again, bigger pieces of cover in this area. You don't just have to fish boulders, and I'm going to show you a few other different lake types that have different types of cover that set up differently, but at least here on Lake Tenkiller in Oklahoma, I find those bigger boulders are very, very effective. Now, another situation that you can run into a lot of times are stumps. And we're going to take a look here at Lake Maumelle. This is one of my home lakes that I grew up fishing. And really quick, guys, if you enjoy watching these Bass Fishing Declassified videos, you can actually download the audio from these episodes through the podcast apps by typing in Fish the Moment Podcast. The Fish the Moment podcast has all of the audio from the Bass Fishing Declassified videos, as well as my Fish the Moment YouTube videos, and some throwbacks of past Fish the Moment videos. We've actually been experimenting by putting the audio from these lake breakdown videos into the podcast, and I would really appreciate if we got some feedback from you guys just by commenting below or leaving us an email at info@fishthemoment.com. We don't know if these lake breakdown videos work that well as podcasts just because you can't see the visuals. So any feedback you could provide would be amazing. Now back to the video. And stumps can be a very effective way to actually catch fish in the fall. And so if we go through these areas, a lot of these things you can, these flats and stuff like that, you can see there's really not much going on. There's barely any cover on these flats. But then all of a sudden you can see that there's a couple of stumps, and it's kind of hard to see these. I've seen them just because I've been out here when the lake is low. I'll circle them right here, but there's a big stump right here. Literally, that's like the size of the front deck of your boat. And then there's another big stump right here. And if you can find these big, giant stumps, like, again, size of the front deck of your boat, they're isolated by themselves. You can absolutely smash them on these and basically just pull up. I would have these waypointed, and I would just fire a topwater over the top of them, spinnerbait, crankbait, things like that. And if I ran enough of these big stumps throughout the day, you can absolutely crush them. And the way I used to do it back in like 2008, 2009 range is I would actually go and I would make a waypoint on my fish finder while the lake was drawn down like this one year, and my boat would be out here, and I would just kind of estimate where the stumps were. And then I would come back the next year when the lake wasn't quite as low. Let's say the lake is at this part of the pool. It's not as low. And I know those stumps are still in that general zone. Or you can obviously nowadays just mark these with a waypoint and just type stump. And then you transfer these waypoints to your fish finder. If you don't know how to do that with Google Earth, I'll link a video down below that shows how to transfer waypoints you make in Google Earth to your fish finder. But either way, now you can fish these isolated stumps, and my recommendation is, just like we talked about with the boulders, you want to have quite a few of them. You're not going to catch fish on every single isolated stump that is out on the lake. My normal, percentage would be maybe one fish every 5, 6, 7 stumps if the pattern's really good, and sometimes even it's one out of every 10 stumps. So if you can have 30, 40 of these stumps found, which like on a lake like Lake Maumelle, that's definitely doable. You can see there are stumps all over these flats. The more isolated, the better, obviously. And sometimes if they're by some type of ditch, like these stumps right here, I've caught a bunch of big fish on over the years. There's 2 big stumps right next to each other, right next to a little ditch. These are ideal. these two stumps right here are really, really good. Sometimes there's even grass on these flats and things like that, but even if there's grass there, the fish will sit up around the stump, around the grass, and you can throw a chatterbait through the grass where those big stumps are and absolutely catch, big fish. And instead of then just randomly fishing this grass flat through here, you find these mega stumps. I mean, this is like one of my favorites. Look at this stump. It's absolutely gigantic. Big stump. And those fish will be right on top of that thing, and they will be just on each of those big stumps, right there, and you can eliminate a ton of water just by going to those and catching a bunch of fish. Not every lake is going to have big boulders, but a lot of lakes are going to have stumps. Especially if it's a man-made reservoir, you're going to be able to find stumps on a lot of lakes, especially if it's a flatter, shallower lake without a ton of cover in it. Stumps can be very, very effective. So that is kind of a secondary option that I would recommend if you're trying to catch better than average fish, big limit fish. And on Lake Maumelle, I have hundreds of stumps marked from just years, where I just kind of know where they all are. And even if I had to go back now of the waypoints, I could go through these areas, graph with side scan, mark all those stumps, and maybe, if you fish the same lake multiple times in a row, go through and spend a day, 4, 5, 6 hours, just marking all the stumps, then come back, and then you can fish those for years to come by having those waypoints on your graph, or at least for the next 3 or 4 fishing trips. And they'll set up on these stumps. I mean, from now in like the beginning of November all the way through like January, they'll set up on these things, especially the stumps that are a little bit deeper, 5 to 10 foot of water. They'll still use those all the way in January, and better quality fish will set up there. So kind of the common denominator between these two is that you have these isolated big objects in the middle of the creeks that are overlooked by other anglers, and it's not just fishing down the bank, it's fishing those specific targets. So that's another big fish type area. Last but not least, let's go to Lake Dardanelle. Lake Dardanelle is more of a river system type lake, and it's a little bit trickier on these river system type lakes because you don't really have a situation where always you're going to have like these perfect stumps or have these bigger rocks and things, and instead you're going to have shallow vegetation. Basically what we're going to do is use Google Earth to find the best stretches of grass by identifying which stretches are still alive in the winter. And this is something I've been doing for, again, years, but the main theory is that I'm going to use Google Earth to find an image when the lake is setting up in the winter time. So this image actually here is from January 29th of 2024. And what I want to find are stretches of grass that stick out into the middle of the lake in the winter time still. So I don't necessarily care about like stretches that are right up against the bank, these like bank grass things. I will sometimes focus on this sort of stuff more in the spring, and I'll make another video in the spring when it comes to that. But my main thing in the fall is I want to find offshore stretches of grass that I can still see that are alive. And a lot of these grass stretches are in like, a foot or two of water. They could be stretches of more like hydrilla. Sometimes it's like coontail. Sometimes it's actually just water willow that's sitting up on the flat like this. But I want to mark these areas that are sticking off the bank. So we got this stretch right here. We have this stretch right here. You can see it kind of is sticking out, just that darker image. Let's kind of roll through here, see if we can find more. Some of these are kind of bigger clumps. There's a little bit sticking out right here, which is actually kind of nice. So you can see that there's like a little bit of grass. And I don't want stuff that's right up against the bank because, again, a lot of anglers are going to fish for that or fish those areas. So I want to find stuff, again, that's like off the bank. So like right in here, you can kind of see that sticks off the bank just a little bit. And then there's another little kind of sneaky stretch right here. Some of the stuff is pretty shallow, but there's that right there. And there's also another little kind of nice little stretch through here. So all this stuff is grass that's still growing up and still alive in January. So that means it's pretty hardy grass. And then if we go back to an image when the lake is like, let's say during the regular fall time of the year, we go to those areas I marked. You'll notice that in here, there's not really any grass growing right now, but it is definitely kind of under the water subsurface. And so you know that grass grows there just based on the fact that we can see it here growing in January, but based on this lake level or the pool it's on, it's actually even underwater, which is even better, even really good. But then like this stretch, you can actually see is still visible. And while this stretch looks maybe pretty good in the fall, it looks like a lot of other stretches. There's a lot of shallow bank grass, a lot of random clumps, a lot of different things around. So why would this clump be worse than this clump? Well, mainly it's because this clump is still alive in the winter, so that means that it's going to be hardier grass. The bait fish are going to be more attracted to it year after year, and the better quality fish I find just set up on it. So if we kind of keep rolling through here, you can see again, this is when the lake is the lake is a little bit up, but there's grass that will grow here. We haven't had an image that recently, so maybe grass hadn't fully stuck in there yet, but it's further enough off the bank that when the lake is up, you barely even see it. If we kind of keep rolling through these stretches, you can see this is actually a really nice piece of water willow that sticks out further off the bank than you might see based on the lake level, but it also is pretty green in the fall, but it also is alive in January. So I wouldn't necessarily go fish like all these pads or all of this grass here or any other grass you might find, this stuff. I'm going to skip all that and go straight to the stretches that are alive in January. Same thing right here. This stretch right here, underwater grass, more underwater grass. You can barely see it with this lake level, but you can see that grass kind of through the water, and there's a bunch more out here. So that is how I would identify these like little offshore stretches. And then if I was going around the lake, I would just pop into these stretches with a chatterbait, with a swim jig, things like that, and just run 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stretches. Run those, and your chances of catching big fish go up a lot. And on these exact stretches I'm marking, I have caught like 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pounders off of them in October. I've actually caught like a 6 3/4 pounder off of this stretch right here in October when you're on Dardanelle. That was like 2013. So anyways, it was a long time ago. But I have caught big ones doing this. So this is kind of a tactic I've used on these kind of lakes that have shallow grass. You can do it on other parts of the lake too. It's not like this is the only area where this works on this lake. And it's a great technique for, again, those shallower, grassier lakes that maybe don't have the stumps or the rocks we showed. So if we kind of recap, you can see that all of the things I'm looking for are smaller, isolated pieces of cover, isolated areas that are, again, maybe the size of the front deck of your boat, the size of your boat, that you can fish very quickly. You need to mark a lot of them, 20, 30 of them if you can, and just run them throughout the day. And every 5 or 10 you pull up on, you have a chance of catching a really, really good quality fish. Use bigger baits, use a big swim bait, a bigger swim jig, spinner bait, crank bait, a big flipping jig. Those are the things I'm going to use in these areas based on the conditions and the water levels and all the other factors. Big topwater can even work. And you can do this with shallow grass. You can do this with those big stumps I showed, or with those big boulders. It works for all those isolated pieces of cover. But if you focus on this, a lot of times you're going to find yourself catching a lot of big fish. Sometimes if you have enough of these areas, you can also catch numbers doing it. But most of the time it's going to be those bigger tournament winning fish, or at least big limit fish that hopefully you can find and put in the boat this fall. And that's it for this episode of Bass Fishing Declassified. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this content. If you did, make sure you leave a comment down below and like the video. And other than that, see you in the next video.